The late great Harold Bloom is my critical hero. Indeed, I call him my literary grandfather, and it saddens me on a regular basis that we were not able to meet and talk and share and indulge in our love of Shakespeare. But it does comfort me to know that he probably would have approved of the deep reading and the love with which we are reading the great books together. So today, in honour of him, I'd like to do something that I've not seen anywhere else, and I'd like to rank his greatest books, at least his top 20, because ranking all of them would be quite difficult. The man was vastly prolific. I want to, if you haven't already come to Bloom, or you've only come to him in a small way, I want to put some great books in your hands so your love can be my love. And I'm going to rank them in somewhat of an order, but I love each and every one of them for their own special reasons, so it was very hard ordering them. I'm trying to order these books based on how resonant they might be, how much they might endure, their own intellectual and aesthetic merit. But indeed, if one, maybe further down the list, appeals to you more than one that's near the top, then go for it. They're all great, and I do hope you pick up not just one, maybe a handful of these books by Harold Bloom. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with number 1, and we're going to run through the list. Now, the first book I would like to recommend to you, one that I'm positive will endure, is Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. If you've ever wanted to get into Shakespeare, or if you've ever found yourself not being able to, or indeed if you just want to share a love for the bard that you already have, all of these reasons and more, I would implore you to come to Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. Harold Bloom is plugging into a tradition of Shakespeare that treats the plays and the sonnets with love and reverence, and we don't see that today. Academics come to Shakespeare with scorn and preloaded ideologies, and they come to try to damn him. This is a shame. Harold Bloom is writing in the same vein as Harold Goddard, whose meaning of Shakespeare is wonderful. He's writing in the same vein as Dr. Samuel Johnson, Hazlitt, Charles Lamb, A.C. Bradley, Shakespearean tragedy. What I would suggest with this is pick a play that you're interested in getting into, and then either read Bloom's essay on the play beforehand or after, and you'll probably be motivated to go through the entire work. Let's get into number 2. Now, the second recommendation I want to give to you is the Western Canon. Unfortunately, many critics have damned this work on account of the list that comes in the back. It's a list of the greatest books in the Western tradition. Bloom has gone on record multiple times and well into his old age saying that he did not want to do the list, and he was contractually obliged. He says the list is lacking because there are some authors on the list that shouldn't be there, and there are many authors who, by virtue of him just not thinking of them, are not on there. So many critics have damned him just by that list, but really what you have here is a collection of wonderful essays on the great books. He's talking about Shakespeare, he's talking about Dante, Chaucer, Cervantes, Montaigne, Molière, Milton, Goethe, Jane Austen, Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, George Eliot, Tolstoy, Ibsen, Freud, Proust. It's wonderful. This is the book that most likely popularised his term, the School of Resentment, what I refer to as the literary pretensia. He referred to covens of academics who do a reading of the great books through their ideologies, and he didn't come down favourably upon them, and he was thereby alienated from them, and that controversial reputation has preceded today. But if you just get past that, if you just penetrate past that, you find a critic who loves the great books and knows them endlessly. Let's get on to the next recommendation. Now, my next recommendation is an anthology, and you might see it behind me. The strength of Harold Bloom lies not just in his critical appreciation or the introductions he does to works, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but he's a very good, one might say great, curator. He's a great anthologizer. If you can get hold of the best poems of the English language, from Chaucer through Robert Frost, you're in for a treat. This book has a special meaning for me. I was quite burnt out during a lockdown year. I had some R&R, I had a little bit of therapy, and I remember unwinding at the end of each day with this book and making notes and just enjoying the poetry. So it means quite a lot to me. His introduction alone is worth the price of entry, and he has many other introductions to each and every poet. If you want to get into poetry, this is probably, well, not probably, without a doubt, the best poetry anthology I can personally think of. So that's my third recommendation. Let's get into the next one. My next recommendation is The Anxiety of Influence, an early book for Bloom, but one that sort of secured his reputation. If you don't know, the Bloomian idea is this idea about influence. Essentially, we are all, or great poets, great writers, are all influenced by their predecessors, and their work is either a reaction against or a continuation of their work. So when he reads great writers, he's usually reading them through the prism of their influence. This book can be a little bit dense and has a lot of obscure terms, but it's worth wrangling with, it's worth wrestling with, and it will help you get to grips with Bloom's theory of aesthetics. My next recommendation might actually be many people's first recommendation. I don't have it with me. I don't have some of these books because they're away in storage currently, but it's How to Read and Why. And my copy is completely dog-eared. It's covered in notes and marginalia. This was actually my introduction to Bloom, and talking about influence, unfortunately, I didn't come to Bloom at an early enough age in order to be significantly influenced by him, at least in the Bloomian sense. But I read him as a kindred spirit, and he offers me comfort and companionship and helps me on my own way, even when my readings differ from his. How to Read and Why is a great introduction to his body of work, and it's a great introduction to the great books. It's slim, it's digestible. He wrote it for the common reader, though it can still be difficult. It has a great introduction, and then he just takes tons of bodies of literature from the Western world to pieces. He talks about the novels, talks about the plays, talks about poems. When I say takes them to pieces, he does so lovingly, and he gets to the heart of why we read them and how to read them, through what lens we should read them. It's a great book. My next recommendation is one that came out posthumously. Bloom passed away at the age of 89. He got to an old age, so one can only be happy about that. But he kept writing right up until he died. Even though he was very ill in his old age, he continued to write, he continued to read, and many of his books contain really tender meditations on the melancholic nature of aging when your friends pass away, not being able to get to sleep or wake up early in the morning in pain, and you just have your mind filled with memories. Indeed, this is why we read Proust. If you want to read the poetry of old age, read the criticisms of Harold Bloom, and you'll find comfort and companionship and wisdom, endless wisdom. This book was a posthumous book, so I think it might have been the last one to come out under his name. It's called The Bright Book of Life. I'm very fortunate to have a first edition, which I'm very proud of. Beautiful, beautiful volume this is, with ruffle-cut pages. This is subtitled Novels to Read and Reread, and he goes through a wonderful selection of books that have kept him comfort and that he has reread endlessly. And these are just meditations on what he thinks about these books, coming to them for the umpteenth time. He talks about Pride and Prejudice, Don Quixote, Clarissa, what else does he talk about? Wuthering Heights, Vanity Fair, Moby Dick, Bleak House, Madame Bovary, Les Miserables, War and Peace, Anna Karenina, Haji Murad. This is not an exhaustive list, I'm just reading some of them out. The Brothers, Karamazov, Nostromo, The Secret Agent, The Rainbow, Ulysses, In Search of Lost Time, To the Lighthouse, Absalom, Ursula K. Le Guin's stuff, Cormac McCarthy, Ralph Ellison. It's a really wonderful, wonderful book. That's my next recommendation for you. Next up, I would like to recommend another book that's behind me that was also posthumously published. I believe this one, just like the one I just showed you, came out in 2020, which was nice, reading these books in a lockdown year. They're big, meaty books, and they give you lots of rabbit holes to follow, or labyrinths, should I say. This is called Take Arms Against the Sea of Troubles. You might notice that Bloom takes his titles from works that he loves. This one's from Hamlet. The Power of the Reader's Mind Over a Universe of Death. And this is a deep dive, and I believe this is actually his last work. This is a deep dive into poetry. He talks about William Shakespeare, Milton, Blake, Wordsworth, Keats, Shelley, Byron, Keats, Browning, Tennyson, Whitman, Frost, Stevens, Yeats, Lawrence, Crane, Freud, and Dante. This one's hard to get into. It's very hard to penetrate. I don't think it's written for the common reader, and it shows Bloom as having a very peculiar reading style or critical style. You can't quite peg it. It's not like my reading style where we live the great books, but it's also not like the other academics who historicise and pigeonhole and contextualise. It's divorced from that. It's grounded in influence. So when he's reading Browning, he's reading all the poets that led up to Browning. So it's quite an exciting way to read. If you just want to be buried in books and not think about the psychological implications, you just want to appreciate them, art for art's sake, Bloom is a good friend to have alongside you. The next book I would like to recommend to you is another posthumous one. As you have noticed, Bloom was wildly prolific towards the end of his life. Indeed, he thought the end of his life was coming for about 20 years before it did. This one is titled, in a phrase that I love, Possessed by Memory, the Inward Light of Criticism. Now, this is basically just Bloom enjoying bits and bobs from poetry and Shakespeare. There's not a whole lot of reading around them. He kind of lets the work speak for itself. He just gives you excerpts and then he gives a little commentary around them. So it's good if you mainly just want a smorgasbord, a platter of poetry that mattered most to him. It's a bit deep cuts, but it means something to me. I read this over and over again and I love this one, so I'd recommend it to you. Let's get into the next recommendation. My next recommendation is a series that Bloom was writing towards the end of his life. You can see it behind me. It's a Shakespeare series. Now, there is one on Lear, the Image of Authority. I don't know where that's gotten to, but you can see there's one on Cleopatra, I Am Fire and Air. You can see there's one on Macbeth, The Dagger of the Mind. We have Iago here, The Strategies of Evil. And we have Falstaff, Give Me Life. And these are beautifully presented. These are just meditations on different Shakespeare plays using a character he's fallen in love with as the entrance to the work. What you'll find when you read these books is that he meditates on single performances. He'll say, oh, I went to this theatre house in 1955 or whenever, or I saw this TV adaptation in 1970 and I fell in love with this actor or actress. And I really like that. I don't know why, there's something eminently autobiographical about that, and it kind of relates to me because I'm always trying to tie the books that I'm reading into things that I've actually seen, into adaptations, into singular readings. But this is a lovely set. To be honest, most of his stuff on Shakespeare is really well contained in the big Shakespeare Invention of the Human. But hey, if you want a deep dive into any of these plays, if you want to learn more about Othello by virtue of Iago, then I would say it's well worth picking up the single volume. Next up, we have a lesser known book called Where Shall Wisdom Be Found? I don't know how many people know about this, but he places two works or two writers next to each other and reads them up against each other. Plato with Homer, Cervantes and Shakespeare, Samuel Johnson and Goethe, Emerson and Nietzsche, Freud and Proust. It's a good one, it's very compact, I like it. What more can I say? The next recommendation I want to give to you is Ruin the Sacred Truths, Poetry and Belief from the Bible to the Present. This isn't a deep dive work, it's just a smattering of essays on Milton and Shakespeare and Freud. It's not exhaustive in terms of what Bloom thought about these ideas, but I just want to bring some love to another lesser known work. If you're interested in biblical stuff, I would also recommend The Shadow of a Great Rock. That's where he reads the King James Bible as literature. Wonderful stuff, something I like to do, something I've done for a while now. He does it really well. He looks at the book of Job. I highly recommend that one if you're interested in scripture. Another one for those interested in scripture is the Book of J, in which Bloom ascertains that some of the early biblical books were actually written, composed, the product of the imagination of a lady of the Solomonic court. Now, some people will say, well, this has never been proven. Well, the contrary has never been proven either. And so Bloom has essentially said, yes, I know this hasn't been proven. I can read some of the lexical choices and the semantical choices as a feminine choice, and he makes a compelling argument for it, and it's very nice. But at the end of the day, he's saying, I'm going to choose the theory that most affects me, that I most enjoy, that most helps exhaust, though you can't really exhaust the Bible, but helps to get the most out of this work. And that happens to be reading the early books as a product of the imagination of a woman rather than a man, because actually you can't prove that a man did it either. So interesting stuff. That's an early book, and again, I don't think many people know about this one. but I'm recommending it to you. Okay, my next recommendation is a map of misreading. I like this one, but you kind of have to read The Anxiety of Influence to get into it. But I actually enjoy this one more. The Anxiety of Influence is rather dense, whereas this is more practically applicable, and we see him mapping different parts of literature, which is fun. Next up, I'd like to recommend another anthology. I love this one. This is Stories and Poems for Extremely Intelligent Children of All Ages. Now, before I came to love Bloom, I thought, I was kind of put off by the title. I thought, really, that's a bit elitist, that's a bit pretentious. But once you get to know him, you know that's just a smog screen. These are really good. They're really good stories. I most certainly will share them with my own children when that day comes. He's made a wonderful selection, and he's ordered them by season. So he has a collection of poems and stories by summer. He's got autumn. He's got winter. He's got spring. Wonderful stuff. I think he believes that the current syllabus in the schools, or most of the schools for children, is woefully inadequate, and he's trying to redress that. Was he successful? I don't know, but wouldn't it be good if he was? My next recommendation is this slim little Hamlet poem unlimited. He basically found that in writing Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, he had so much more to say about Hamlet because he was interested in the initial penning of Hamlet, the Hamlet, the Hamlet that came many years before that we don't have a copy of. And so he started digging, and then he got swept away by Hamlet. Hamlet being, I don't know, maybe my second favourite of Shakespeare plays, my first being King Lear. It's wonderful. If you're interested in Hamlet, I'd highly recommend this one. The next recommendation is a book called The Anatomy of Influence. I actually really like this one. Again, I don't know if many people know this. It's got a nice, beautiful white cover. It's got essays on basically all my favourite writers, Shelley being a prime instance. That one's really nice. I have strong memories of that, reading that throughout lockdown and finding that to be actually a real comfort. I love his style of art for art's sake criticism. It just soothes me. You might also like this anthology. This is my next recommendation. Till I End My Song, a gathering of last poems. These are a collection of poems, and they are collected by virtue of the fact that they're the last poems the poet penned before they died. It's good stuff. If you think American literature hasn't been given enough love, then Harold Bloom most certainly has. I would highly recommend his book, The Demon Knows. He talks about Whitman, Dickinson, all the greats really. You might also like this. It's a compilation of essays called The American Canon, Literary Genius from Emerson to Pynchon, 5 decades of writing on American literature. Now, this has been compiled. I don't think this was a book that Bloom consciously would have put together, but the essays are hobbled together from, I believe, the introductions to the Chelsea House series, which I'll talk about in a moment. But there's good stuff here. He talks about Poe. He's not a fan of Poe. He talks about Thoreau, Whitman, Emerson, Hawthorne, Melville, Dickinson, Twain, James, Wharton, Dreiser, Frost, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, T.S. Eliot, Zora Neale Hurston, Catherine Ann Porter, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Faulkner, Nabokov, Crane, Hemingway, Elizabeth Bishop, Tennessee Williams, Ralph Ellison, Carson McCullers, James Baldwin, Flannery O'Connor, Ursula K. Le Guin, Toni Morrison, J. Wright, Don DeLillo, Thomas Pynchon, Philip Roth, and many more. So if you're interested in American lit, that book is rather lit. Now, a couple of honourable mentions. The Chelsea House series. This was a project that Bloom undertook to compile anthologies of essays on all the great books. He has hundreds of these volumes, and for a long time he would write, I think he said he wrote like 5+ introductions to these volumes a day, because there were so many getting churned out, and he was also organising, getting the different writers together. It's really, really good. I used these back in Oxford at university before I even really knew who Bloom was. I was studying Joseph Conrad for my dissertation, and there happened to be a Bloom guide from this publishing house. It was really nice reading about Bloom's reading for these books. He had to completely immerse himself in rereading these great novels so that he could pen introductions to them. Another honourable mention is simply the introductions that he does to other books. He was a huge fan of Hart Crane, a very difficult poet that I don't think enough people know about. He wrote the introduction to this volume. The poems of Hart Crane were the first poems he fell in love with. He tells a nice story of being a child and going to the library, getting the collection of Hart Crane, and whenever the time came to return it, he would just renew it and renew it until his older sister bought him his first book of poetry, which was this book. But his meditations at the front of books like that are very useful. He's done a lot to promote Wallace Stevens and get him into the modern canon. He's done a great introduction to the Edith Grossman edition of Don Quixote, which is worth picking up for that alone. He's also got an introduction to the Everyman volume of Proust, which is nice, but might contain a few spoilers. But it definitely hits a few nails on the head. So it's always a nice treat when you pick up a book and you're like, oh, there's an introduction from Harold Bloom. So those are my recommendations for you today. Let me know, have you read any Bloom books? If so, what do you recommend? Have I got it right? Have I left anything off? If so, let me know. And if you're coming to him for the first time, let me know which one you're going to start with in the comments below. If you've enjoyed this video, then I'd like to thank you very much for watching, and please hit the like button and subscribe, because that tells me to keep making more videos. Have a lovely day and happy reading.